Hello, welcome to Big Picture Monday. Are you excited to learn about Abraham? You can be honest with that answer. I think sometimes he just seems like this old ancient guy that we hear a lot about his covenant, right? But this is the week. We're going to learn about who this Abraham really was. And I think you're going to like it. I think you're going to relate a lot to Abraham's story as well as his wife's story, Sarah. And it's going to be cool. I'm excited to dive into it. Not only has our current prophet talked a lot about the Abrahamic covenant, so I think it's important to study that this week because, yep, we get to learn about the covenant too. But I think Abraham is a fantastic person and we get to learn about who he was, so that he's not just kind of this like, oh yes, there's Abraham in the Bible and he seems like this old guy who made a covenant and that's it. There's so much more to his story, and I'm excited to dive into that. This week, we are studying Abraham chapters 1 and 2, and then Genesis chapters 12 through 17. So that's what I'll be telling you in story format this week. And I have to tell you, I mean, I love doing Big Picture Monday, but I think it's going to start being especially useful now because one thing that I pride myself on is I love reading and studying a whole bunch. And then I distill it down into what you actually need to know. And we're getting to that point where we're just going to be kind of cruising through a lot of these Genesis chapters. And sometimes there's stuff where you're like, okay, am I supposed to be remembering this person's name and where we are and what's important? Like as you're going through it, because there's just so much information sometimes as we're going through this next little part here. And so that's what I'm going to help you do this week and on in the future, and that's what I do in my study guides, especially even more in more detail, is I walk you through what do you actually need to know? Like what's the stuff that you're like, okay, wait, that was an important location, I know that, or I don't really need to know that. So let's dive into what you actually need to know for this week. That way you can focus on, of course, listening to the Spirit and allowing the Lord to guide your study of the scriptures and learn and change because of Abraham and Sarah. Now, this kind of starts the second half of Genesis. That's what most scholars call this. The first half up until now has been about the history of the world, right? We have like the creation of the earth. We have Adam and Eve, and we have Cain and Abel, and then we have Enoch's story and Noah, and then we ended with the Tower of Babel. People are scattered. There's languages everywhere. From now on, like Genesis chapter 12 till the end of Genesis, pretty much the Lord's going to do a case study for us where he is going to follow just one family through multiple generations, and he is going to prove to us that he keeps his promises. Okay? It's kind of cool because there clearly were other righteous people at this time, but we're not getting a history of the world. We are getting a history of one family, of a patriarch and a matriarch, and then following generation after generation, and we'll do that in future weeks. But this week we're focused around Abraham and Sarah as the patriarch and matriarch of their family. And we're going to put this to the test. Does the Lord keep his promises to people who make covenants with him? I think you'll like the answer for that. All right. And then I want to point out, when you're reading Genesis, you're going to start reading about people named Abram and Sarai. And if you're like, wait a second, did they spell this wrong in here? Abraham and Sarah were actually, their original names are Abram and Sarai. And their names will actually be changed in the last chapter that we study this week. So we'll get to why that happens. But in Genesis, it will talk about Abram and Sarai. Yes, they're the same people. Their name will change later on. When we're reading the Abraham account, because we are in the book of Abraham for chapters 1 and 2, it calls them Abraham and Sarah the entire time. So just heads up on that. Now, we're finishing the book of Abraham this week with chapters 1 and 2 because we've already studied chapters 3 through 5. 3 through 5 were the big vision that Abraham has from the Lord that talks about the premortal existence and the creation of the earth. We studied those way back in the beginning of January. So now we are getting the beginning of Abraham's story with chapters 1 and 2, which corresponds with our Genesis account, which means after this week, we are totally done with the Pearl of Great Price. We will be 100% in the Old Testament after this week. So this is our last time with the book of Abraham. Now, I am going to suggest that you start studying with the book of Abraham. Even though in the Come Follow Me manual, it starts with the Genesis accounts. It lists those first, and then it has Abraham afterwards, which would make you think, oh, I'll read Genesis first. I recommend starting with the Abraham account because just like everything in the Pearl of Great Price, we get so much more detail in the Pearl of Great Price. So start with chapters 1 and 2 of Abraham, and I'll tell you what happens in them. And then when we go to the Genesis account, it's really easy to see like, okay, it's pretty much chapter 12 that's just a repeat, and then the rest is different. So that's how I'm going to tackle it today too. Let's start with Abraham chapter 1. Abraham was a righteous guy. Like I said, I love that we get to learn about him as a real person and not just the old guy that made covenants. I'm sorry for thinking that. But he had really righteous desires, but he had a super rough upbringing. And we learn about that in Abraham chapter 1. We learned that he was even, they attempted to make a human sacrifice out of young Abram. And Abram called upon the Lord, and the Lord came and stopped that sacrifice and killed all the Egyptian priests that were involved in that. We learned that his father even was on board with this. Like, his father wasn't a great influence. Abram did not have a great upbringing, but he kept calling on the Lord. He knew there were more things for him. And then we also get this kind of commentary from Abraham where he talks about the importance of record keeping. And he teaches us a little bit about Egypt and how he knows that he needs to be keeping these records. Now in chapter 2, the Lord tells Abram, okay, it's time to leave this land. Like, this is not a good place for you anymore. Abram is married at this point to his wife Sarai. And they also travel with Abram's nephew, so his brother's son, named Lot, and Lot's wife. And they also bring along Abram's dad, who had kind of had a change of heart and was ready to do something new. So they travel to a land called Haran. Now, while they're there, dad actually gets caught up in some false idol worship again. So not a true change of heart. But Abram and Sarai and Lot and his wife are told by the Lord, go preach, go minister, like go and do, this is what you're here for. So they go to a land called Canaan, which is going to be very important. So pay attention to that one, in Canaan. And then after a while, there's a huge famine in the land. So they're all driven to Egypt. Okay. And that's where the Abraham account really leaves off. Genesis 12 covers a lot of the same stuff. So in Genesis 12, you'll see that the Lord promises Abram a lot of blessings and that his seed will be numberless. And then at the end, you'll see that they are driven to Egypt because of this great famine in the land. Now, I'm just going to tell you right now, there's a story at the end of chapter 12 where Abram and Sarai are about to go into Egypt. And Abram says, like, Sarai is so beautiful and everyone's going to want to marry her. So I'm going to pretend she's my sister instead. And you might be thinking, what? What is going on here? There aren't great answers. I've looked into a lot of research. There's not great answers, like many things in the Old Testament, for why things are the way that they are. The best guess is that if Abram was just married to Sarai and the Egyptian Pharaoh was like, I want her instead, they would just kill Abram. And then Sarai would be the Pharaoh's wife, right? Like that, or one of his wives. That's just what they would do. But if Abram was like, oh, she's my sister, the Pharaoh might still take her, which does happen. But they're not going to kill Abram for her, if that makes sense. But they do eventually get Sarai back, and the Lord curses the Pharaoh for taking Sarai. Okay, chapter 13. So this is Abram, Sarai, Lot, and Lot's wife in Egypt because of the famine, right? The famine ends eventually. They get to move back. And when they are moving back, they settle. They've got these two households, right? The household of Abram, the household of Lot. And that's where they are. There starts to be a little bit of contention between them. Pretty much there's not enough room for both of them. And so Abram comes to Lot and says, listen, I'll be the peacemaker. You go wherever you want, and then I will go wherever I want, and let's give each other some space here. And Lot really had, they had a good relationship together. I think sometimes in my mind, I've painted Lot as a not so great guy. He didn't always make the best decisions, but they had a good relationship, and Abram wanted to keep the peace with his nephew. So Lot moved eastward to a land with all of his possessions and all of his household. They both were pretty prosperous at this point. And he did go right by this town called Sodom. So that's where Lot decided to go. Meanwhile, Abram was shown in a vision by the Lord that his seed would inherit the land of Canaan and that it would be this beautiful place for him. So both Abram and Lot are kind of getting differences here. Now in chapter 14, we learn that Lot is now living in Sodom. And at this point, there is a war. And here's where I'm here to tell you what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to in chapter 14, because there are a lot of names and places being listed. Pretty much you don't need to remember most of that. All you need to know is there's a huge war and Lot and his entire household and all of his possessions are taken captive. And Abram hears word about this and he's like, not on my watch. I'm going to go save him. So he arms all of his servants, everyone that he has, and he goes and he saves Lot. Like he saves Lot and his whole household and a bunch of other people as well. We only get a few verses about it, but it seems like a pretty dramatic story here. So Lot is saved from the clutches of the other side in this little battle. But tucked away at the end of chapter 14 is something that is super important, and that is that Abram meets a guy named Melchizedek. Yep, that Melchizedek, the one that you can't spell, but you know his name pretty well. That's the guy. Now, in the Genesis account, we get a brief interaction between Abram and Melchizedek, but you have to read the Joseph Smith translation that comes at the end of chapter 14. If you're in the physical scriptures, you'll have to go to the appendix for that. If you're in your Gospel Library app, you can just click on it and read on it, because we learn about who Melchizedek was. He was this great guy. He was actually trying to build up kind of like a city of Enoch type of situation with a whole bunch of righteous people. And we also learn from modern revelation, Melchizedek gave the priesthood to Abram. And we do know that he was ordained to the office of high priest. So pretty interesting stuff kind of tucked away at the end of Genesis 14. You're like, wait a second. I know that person. Pretty cool. Okay, Genesis chapter 15, you also are going to want to read the Joseph Smith translation because there's some really cool things. Abram goes to the Lord. At this point, he still doesn't have any kids. And this is not only just sad because people who desire kids want to have kids, but this is also like the Lord keeps promising him that he's going to have numberless seed. And also in that day, you needed to have kids in order to keep your household going and to keep your inheritance. Like it was a necessity. And so Abram goes to the Lord and is just like, I want children. And Sarai cannot have children. Like, what do we do? And the Lord gives Abraham a beautiful, beautiful promise, talking about, again, his seed will be numberless, but also talks about that his seed will also fall into captivity. And then they will be saved about 400 years later, which, spoiler alert, talking about Moses there, okay? But kind of an interesting little side note about that. Now, in Genesis chapter 16, we then get kind of Sarai's side of the story. She, of course, wants to have children, but at this point, she is getting older, she's considered barren, and so she does something that is actually very normal in that time and something that sounds very weird to us, which is she has a handmaid named Hagar, and she gives Hagar to her husband, Abram, so that he can continue his seed, so that they can have children to support them. And it happens, they have a child named Ishmael, okay? And the Lord actually told them what the name should be. So Hagar gives birth to a child named Ishmael. This is technically Abram's first son here. So it's kind of exciting, but also Sarai definitely has some mixed feelings about it. So it's kind of interesting to see things from her perspective. And then finally, chapter 17, the last one, you guys, this one is the big one. This is where the Abrahamic covenant is like really spelled out. Let's be real. The Lord has hinted at it for like many chapters previously, and he's going to renew it again with Abraham in the future and with his son and so on and so forth. We're going to hear about it a ton more times because, like, of course, our brains need a lot of repetition. But Genesis chapter 17 is like the real initial covenant here that the Lord makes with Abraham. And he tells Abraham, listen, be perfect, be righteous, have integrity, be a good person. And then I covenant that your seed will be as numberless as the earth, and that your wife Sarai will give birth to a son, and that you need to call his name Isaac. And this is all given in this beautiful revelation from the Lord. It also talks a lot about circumcision being the sign of the covenant for that time. It's just like a really cool chapter to read through, especially when we have so much knowledge, modern day knowledge about this Abrahamic covenant. And like I said, we're going to see it repeated over and over again because the Lord just keeps renewing it. That's what he's proven to us. That's what he's proving to us in the Bible, basically, is like, I will keep these promises. And so we're going to keep seeing that. Okay, that is it for this week. Lots of stuff about, last thing, that in chapter 17 is when they change their names. So the Lord tells them, Abram, you are now Abraham, and Sarai, you are now Sarah. So when they made this powerful covenant with the Lord, he also gave them a new name to go by. So I think that's just kind of an interesting little thing to notice as well. Okay, so that's it. We're learning all about Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai. They're the same people, you guys. We start with Abraham, chapters 1 and 2, learning about Abraham's upbringing and then how he got out of the land of where he was born, stopped a little bit in Haran and Canaan and went to Egypt. And then in the Genesis chapters, we're learning about same thing. They end up in Egypt, but then they get to go back. We have Abraham and Lot's household kind of separating. We've got this war where between other people, but Abram goes and rescues Lot along with all the rest of his household. Excuse me. And then we see Abram just pleading over and over again for children. The Lord keeps promising him these numberless seed. Sarai eventually, just kind of out of the pain of her heart, I imagine, gives Hagar to her husband, and he has a son named Ishmael. And then we have the real covenant in chapter 17, where Abraham is promised great blessings, and his name is changed to Abraham. Sarai's name is changed to Sarah, and she's promised that she will have a son. And this son, any potential son they may or may not have, would have precedence as the real firstborn son. So even though Abraham just had a son, I think it's about 13 years later. So Ishmael's about 13 years old at this point. But even though Abraham already has a son, Ishmael, because Abraham and Sarah are like the original couple, husband and wife, any son that they have would actually receive the inheritance. But the Lord also promises that Ishmael will still be blessed. And I love that. He always definitely is keeping an eye out for both Hagar and Ishmael. I've been promising them blessings. But any son that Abraham and Sarah have would continue the actual covenant that the Lord is making with Abraham. Okay, that's it for this week. It was kind of a long one, so thanks for staying with me, but I hope it gives you this overview because we can't just skip over Abraham. He is not some boring old guy. He is real, and he made so many promises with the Lord, and he had these real emotions, and he went through some crazy stuff in his past. And then we also get to learn a lot about Sarah. We get quite a bit of insight into what was going on in her mind and some things that she went to the Lord about, which I love, which is really cool. This is a case study. The Lord is proving he keeps his promises to his people. So, of course, that's going to be my spiritual focus question for this week is, what promises do I see the Lord keeping in my life? Ooh. That's kind of a big one. But where do I see those promises being kept? That's what I'm going to work on focusing this week. Okay, now that you see the big picture, go and study these chapters, or as many of these chapters as you can, you guys. Remember, you don't have to get through this whole curriculum if you can't. It's more about touching with the Spirit every single day and having little touch points like that. So sit down with the scriptures at some point each day, just for a little bit if you can, and allow the Spirit to show you then the spiritual applications of this amazing story of this fascinating couple and then family that we're going to follow. Okay, hope you have a great week and happy studying.